Smoke curls through Berlin's command room. Officers freeze as a courier slams a telegram onto the table, stamped Tokyo. Saipan has fallen, he says. The generals lean over maps. Entire Japanese fortresses. Bypassed, skipped, left to starve. Outside, distant Allied bombers rumble overhead, a sound no one in Berlin can ignore. Germany's finest strategists can't believe it. How could the Americans move faster than an empire built for defense? And the question that haunts them, and you, is this. What made America's Pacific strategy so unstoppable that even the most hardened generals were left in disbelief? In 1942, Japan looked untouchable. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Solomon Islands, its empire stretched across 6,000 miles of ocean. Every island, every atoll was turned into a fortress. Pillboxes, tunnels, and airfields, all carved into coral and rock. Their high command believed this outer defense line was impenetrable. If America tried to advance, they'd be forced to storm every island one by one, bleeding men and ships until their will collapsed. It wasn't arrogance. On paper, it made sense. Japan's garrisons were spread like teeth across the Pacific, each capable of inflicting massive casualties. And the last time the U.S. faced such entrenched defenses, at Bataan and Corregidor, it had ended in disaster. But by 1943, something had changed. The United States wasn't fighting to survive anymore. It was fighting to win. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were running night and day. Liberty ships rolled off the docks faster than Japan could sink them. Pilots were training by the thousands. America's industrial engine, the one Hitler mocked as soft, was now producing more tanks, planes, and carriers than all of Axis Europe combined. And somewhere in that surge of momentum, two men, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, began shaping a plan that would bypass Japan's strongest points. Altogether, they called it island hopping. What made it revolutionary wasn't what they took, but what they ignored. Instead of throwing lives at every fortress, the Americans would leapfrog across the Pacific, capturing only the islands that mattered strategically, ones with airfields, harbors, or proximity to Japan's homeland. Every bypassed island was left to wither on the vine, its troops cut off from supplies, trapped, and slowly starved. The concept was brutal in its simplicity, and terrifying in its efficiency. By early 1944, Japan's outposts were no longer defending the empire. They were dying for it. In Berlin, German intelligence began receiving intercepted reports. Entire Japanese garrisons, sometimes tens of thousands strong, had been stranded and silenced. American fleets were moving with a precision that the Wehrmacht had never achieved, even in its prime. To the German High Command, still obsessed with taking every inch of ground, this was unthinkable. How could the Americans, who once stumbled in North Africa, now dismantle an empire by not fighting it head-on? That question hung in the air as the Allies closed in from every direction. The Pacific in 1943 was vast, blue, and merciless. For months, U.S. forces had been advancing through the Solomon Islands, testing a strategy no army had ever tried before: conquer by skipping. The first real test came at Tarawa, a coral atoll so small it barely appeared on maps, but fortified like a miniature fortress. Japanese engineers had turned it into a labyrinth of bunkers, seawalls, and machine gun nests. When the U.S. Marines landed in November 1943, many never even made it to the shore. Amphibious tractors snagged on reefs. Men drowned under packs. Others waded through chest-deep water into machine gun fire. For 76 brutal hours, the fighting raged. When it ended, nearly all 4,800 Japanese defenders were dead. The Marines lost over 1,000 men, but the message was clear. America could take an island and even a fortress. And once Tarawa fell, the blueprint was set. From that point forward, every move became part of a giant chessboard. In January 1944, the next domino, Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This time the U.S. Navy came prepared. Bombardment was relentless. Days of naval artillery and airstrikes turned the island into white dust. Marines landed behind precise timing, backed by engineers and amphibious tanks. The Japanese defenders, cut off, undersupplied, terrified, fell in days. By February, the Stars and Stripes was flying over Kwajalein. To Berlin, this speed was shocking. On the Eastern Front, Germany had thrown entire armies at cities like Stalingrad for months, sometimes years, only to gain rubble. Meanwhile, the Americans were seizing fortified islands in less than a week. The difference wasn't just firepower. It was logistics. Each leap forward was supported by an unprecedented machine. Floating supply bases, mobile hospitals, repair ships, and carrier task forces that followed the advance like a traveling city. Fuel, food, ammunition, all moved across thousands of miles of ocean without pause. Japan's commanders could barely move a convoy without losing it to submarines. America was moving entire fleets. By mid-1944, the campaign reached its defining moment, Saipan. It wasn't just another island, it was the key to Japan's heart. From Saipan's airfields, American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The Japanese Imperial Command knew what was at stake. They threw everything they had, their planes, tanks, even civilians, right into the defense. The battle became one of the bloodiest in the Pacific. When it was over, nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Thousands of civilians, indoctrinated by propaganda, committed suicide rather than surrender. The Americans had taken the island, but what it revealed was even more terrifying. Japan's defensive ring, that supposedly unbreakable wall of islands, was hollowing from within. When word of Saipan's fall reached Berlin, it wasn't just the Japanese who were shaken. In the German high command, officers pored over maps, stunned by how fast the U.S. had crossed an ocean once considered unconquerable. One strategist reportedly said, "They fight a different kind of war." He was right. Where Germany relied on speed and fear, America relied on reach, the kind that didn't stop, didn't break, and didn't need to occupy every inch of ground to win. This is where the strategy that began as a daring gamble becomes unstoppable, and where the German generals, staring at their maps thousands of miles away, finally realized Japan's empire isn't collapsing slowly, it's imploding. By mid-1944, the Pacific Ocean had become an American highway. Fleet carriers moved like wolves through the waves, guarded by destroyers, fueled by tankers, shadowed by submarines. Ahead lay the Marianas and Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the last major barrier before the Japanese homeland. Tokyo called them the absolute defense line. To the Americans, they were stepping stones. When the invasion began in June 1944, Japan threw everything it had left. Over 400 carrier-based aircraft launched to crush the U.S. fleet in one decisive blow. They believed it would be their midway, a chance to turn back time. Instead, it became the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a massacre so one-sided that U.S. pilots later called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. From the skies, it was slaughter. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying outdated Zeros, faced radar-guided American fighters that tore them apart before they could even see their targets. In 2 days, Japan lost over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. It wasn't just defeat, it was extinction. Those pilots represented the last of Japan's veteran airmen, men who had trained for years, now gone in a weekend. The Imperial Navy would never recover. On the beaches of Saipan, the Marines pressed inland through heat and fire. Caves turned into fortresses. Civilians hid in fear. The Japanese defense was fanatical. Suicidal charges, last-ditch tank attacks, entire battalions vaporized by naval artillery. But by July 9th, the island was secured. The Americans had paid a heavy price and over 3,000 dead, but the victory opened a door no one could close again. From Saipan's new airfields, B-29 bombers could now reach Tokyo itself. In Berlin, the shock was immediate. German intelligence analysts read the reports with disbelief. The Japanese absolute defense line, the Pacific equivalent of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, had fallen in less than a month. One German naval officer reportedly muttered, "They are fighting a war we do not understand." He was right. Germany's campaigns were wars of attrition. America's was a war of precision, moving faster than the enemy could respond, cutting arteries instead of bludgeoning limbs. To the German high command, already drowning under Allied air raids and the Eastern Front collapse, the Pacific news felt like a forecast of their own fate. If Japan's ocean empire could fall that fast, what chance did Fortress Europe have? But the Americans weren't done. The next leap would be bigger, deadlier, and closer to home. Japan's nightmare wasn't the loss of islands. It was what those islands now made possible. The U.S. had secured the launch pad for the destruction of Japan's cities and the final collapse of its war machine. October 1944. The Philippines, a sprawling archipelago critical to Japan's supply lines and national pride, were next. The Americans launched Operation King the Tune, a massive amphibious assault to reclaim Leyte. This was not a small operation. Over 200,000 troops, hundreds of ships, and nearly 1,800 aircraft would converge. Japan responded with desperation. Their navy, already a shadow of its former self after the Marianas, mounted a plan for one final decisive strike. It was the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Across 4 days, the Pacific became a storm of steel and fire. Japanese battleships and aircraft carriers attacked in waves, attempting to crush the invading force. But American radar, air superiority, and coordination turned their strikes into slaughter. Planes fell from the sky like rain. Ships burned and sank, often before a single gun could fire. In the end, Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft, and thousands of sailors, losses it could never replace. By the end, the Imperial Navy was effectively annihilated. Japan could no longer defend its homeland. On the islands themselves, Marines faced fanatical resistance. At Leyte, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike continued to fight in suicidal charges. The Americans took heavy casualties, over 3,600 dead. But every inch of land secured meant a step closer to Tokyo. By December, the Philippines were largely in American hands. For German generals watching, this was an impossible reality. Reports described Japanese forces stranded, cut off, and destroyed, their empire evaporating not from one front, but from 2 oceans away. One officer, reviewing captured Japanese dispatches, wrote, "Them the Americans do not fight like other nations. They do not give battle to be seen. They give battle to end it." That line echoed in Berlin. The same generals who had marveled at Blitzkrieg now realized America's Pacific strategy was faster, smarter, and utterly lethal, and it had no counterpart in Europe. By the end of 1944, the Pacific map had changed forever. The U.S. had leapfrogged over heavily fortified islands, destroyed Japan's navy, and established air bases within bombing range of the homeland. For German observers, the lesson was chilling. Island hopping wasn't just a tactic. It was proof that industrial power, strategic patience, and technological innovation could dismantle empires faster than any blitzkrieg, and in a way that left the world watching, stunned. America had proven that warfare wasn't just about occupying ground. It was about controlling possibility. The collapse of Japan's Pacific defenses wasn't gradual. It was a chain reaction, unstoppable, inevitable, and watched by German eyes with a mixture of awe and terror. By mid-1945, the Pacific was unrecognizable. Once thriving islands lay in ruins. Coral atolls were pockmarked by artillery and bombs. Villages and airfields burned, their smoke rising into skies already darkened by the haze of battle. The Japanese army had been shattered. Millions were stranded on isolated islands, cut off from supplies and hope. Starvation, disease, and despair replaced the once celebrated discipline of the imperial forces. Entire garrisons numbering tens of thousands slowly disappeared into the ocean or into silence. For the Americans, victory came at a staggering price as well. Marines and sailors bore wounds that would never fully heal. Men lost arms, legs, or entire units in brutal assaults on coral beaches and fortified caves. Those who survived carried memories that no medal could honor. Yet every sacrifice yielded strategic gold. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became launchpads for B-29 bombers. Leyte Gulf ensured the Japanese Navy could no longer challenge Allied sea power. Every island taken shortened the path to Tokyo, turning the once impenetrable Pacific into a highway for victory. From the German perspective, reports of these battles arrived like fragments of a nightmare. Generals compared notes in Berlin. Entire fleets neutralized. Veteran pilots lost, garrisons stranded without resupply. The scale and speed of America's advance made every prior calculation obsolete. They had expected months of grinding attrition. Instead, the campaign unfolded in weeks. One German officer recorded, "We watched an empire crumble in silence miles and oceans away, and we could do nothing to stop it. Even Hitler's strategists could not grasp it. Germany's own defenses were collapsing under the Red Army and Allied bombers. Yet across the Pacific, America demonstrated a blueprint for industrialized warfare that ignored tradition and relied purely on momentum. The island-hopping campaign also forced a re-evaluation of military doctrine worldwide. It proved that bypassing a fortified enemy, cutting supply lines, isolating strongholds, and striking where it mattered most, could achieve what frontal assaults never could. It wasn't just a campaign. It was a lesson in efficiency, patience, and ruthless logic. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For Americans, the victories instilled a sense of invincibility, a belief that no empire, no matter how vast, could withstand the combined power of industrial production and strategic patience. For Germans observing from Europe, it was the opposite. Reports of Japanese positions collapsing, whole fleets vanishing, and cities threatened by air raids sent a chilling message. The war in the Pacific was ending decisively, and Germany's allies were crumbling. By the time Okinawa was secured in mid-1945, it was clear that the tide of war had shifted irreversibly. By mid-1945, the American advance was unstoppable. Okinawa had fallen after nearly 3 months of grinding combat. The Japanese defenders had fought to the last man. Civilians hid in caves, terrified of both bullets and propaganda that told them surrender meant dishonor. From these islands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo in hours. Every air raid that followed would make the capital a shadow of its former self. America's campaign had turned the Pacific into a launch pad, not just for battles, but for the final hammer blow. Japan's empire, once sprawling from Korea to the Solomon Islands, was reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. Supply lines were cut. Communication was fragmented. Morale was shattered. Soldiers on distant atolls were left to die quietly, abandoned by the homeland they once served. The effectiveness of island hopping was undeniable. By bypassing fortified positions, the U.S. preserved its strength while systematically dismantling Japan's ability to wage war. Every leap forward increased pressure, shortening the war while saving countless American lives. Meanwhile, in Berlin, German generals could only watch. Reports detailed the collapse of Japan's defenses. Veteran pilots lost, fleets sunk, islands taken in weeks rather than months. For the first time, they realized the full magnitude of what American industrial might and strategic patience could accomplish. One memo noted, "The Americans have achieved in months what we could not in years. Their reach, their coordination, it defies comprehension." This wasn't just a military lesson. It was a psychological one. Germany's allies were falling, their methods rendered obsolete by American innovation and determination. And yet, amidst all the destruction, one truth became clear. The Pacific Campaign was a model of strategy, sacrifice, and relentless pressure. The Americans had proven that warfare could be surgical in its planning, ruthless in execution, and devastating in results, all while preserving the initiative and momentum. Every island captured, every airfield secured, every fleet destroyed brought the Allies one step closer to victory. For the Germans, the lesson was haunting. For the Americans, it was definitive. If you love real World War II stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, the kind that show strategy, courage, and industrial power in ways textbooks never do, subscribe for more. Because these are the war stories they never told in school. Island hopping wasn't just a military strategy. It was a lesson in patience, precision, and perseverance. The Americans didn't need to storm every fortress. They didn't need to crush every soldier. They moved with purpose, striking where it mattered, leaving the rest to crumble on its own. The human cost was immense. Lives lost, islands destroyed, entire communities swept away in the tide of war. Yet the efficiency of the campaign shortened the conflict and saved countless others. For German generals, the shock was twofold: admiration and disbelief. An empire thought unshakable collapsed under a strategy they could neither imagine nor counter. History remembers the battles, the maps, and the headlines. But what lingers, the quiet truth, is the lesson in restraint and momentum. Victory isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about knowing which fights to take and which to let fade. America proved that in the Pacific. It wasn't just power that won the war. It was patience. The kind that changes history, reshapes empires, and leaves observers, even those on the other side of the world, stunned into silence.